Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to be going over the MUI Stepper component. Now if you're not familiar with what a stepper component is, I don't blame you. This is probably one of the not as used components, but also sort of useful component, which is funnily enough. But a stepper is essentially something that helps people, do something like fill out information in a linear manner, or go through a certain amount of steps that you want them to go through one by one. And that's pretty much all that it is. So for example, we see here, if we click the next button, right now we're on the select campaign settings. If we were to click next, we would be on the next quote step, which is create an ad group, and then create an ad. So I think they try to, this whole flow, this example sort of emulates what it's like to create a Facebook advertisement. If you've never done it before, all it is essentially you're creating a campaign first, and then after you create the campaign, you create an ad group with the settings from the campaign, and then you create an ad from the settings with the ad group. So it's sort of a way to get users to fill out information in sort of an easy to digest manner, and making sure that one thing is done after the other when it comes to filling something out or performing an action on your site. Um, and before I jump straight into the code examples, I just want to say thank you so much for all the support. I've been loving the comments that I've been getting. I read every one. Once again, the stepper was a request for someone on my last video, so thank you for that suggestion. And I just hope you guys know I read every single comment. I love hearing from you guys. It means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. So if you find value in this video, please consider leaving a comment, leaving a like, or subscribing to the channel. It means so much to me. And with that out of the way, let's jump in. So I really want to show you guys sort of examples of all the different steppers you can have, briefly talk about a couple of different props, and then I want to dive into the simplest example of what a stepper is. And spoiler alert, it's actually somewhat complex. So I'm going to try and walk you through that so that you get a complete idea of how everything works. And I want to break it down piece by piece, because if you just look at it as one whole, it's really confusing. But if you break the code down sort of piece by piece, you sort of understand where everything has it. And the way they coded it in the documentation is not my favorite. I think there's a lot of things that could really confuse people from using this component. Maybe that's why it's not used as much. But I really want to break it down for you guys. So we'll see here that this was the easiest example. Pretty much it has what is known as a linear flow. On the second thing, you have an example to skip that step, and then finish on the last step. So you'll see here that there's only one thing that is optional, and that's that second step. If we scroll down, you'll see here that we just have a couple of different examples. For example, this one shows you how to do things with customized things. So for example, this little icon will be customized. The bar that goes from one to the next one will be customized. This example is pretty much just setting the alternate label prop. And pretty much what these are is you can set the label below the icon instead of right next to the icon. That's really all that is. And then like I said, here you have examples of customizing sort of the way the stepper looks by changing what these icons look like and the stepper between them. Then you have something called nonlinear. So nonlinear is sort of weird. What nonlinear means is, if you saw here, if a step was not optional, for example, this first step is not optional. So when you click next, it assumes that that step has been completed and you go on to the next thing. This one is optional, so you can click skip. And then the third one is not optional. So when you click finish, it assumes that it completes it and it goes into a check mark. Now, a nonlinear stepper is when you can sort of go between all the different tasks, and it will not be marked as completed until you click the actual complete step button. So you'll see here I've been clicking next and I'm on the third step here, but there's no check marks for the last two. Unless I go back, I click complete, then maybe I'll come here, I'll click complete, and then I'll come here. And I think this one's might be, right, since it's the last step that has to be completed, if I click finish, that will show that all of them have been completed. So that's all that nonlinear really means. It means that you're not completing these steps in any given order. They have an example combining nonlinear with alternate label. They have an example of sort of putting an error in one of them, and then finally they have a an example of passing in the vertical prop, which will make each one of these steppers, instead of going from side to side, it will show up using the collapse component under the hood. And it sort of looks like an accordion. It'll just show whatever step you're on. This could be sort of smooth. It really depends on the type of application you're building, but I personally really like the vertical stepper. And then finally, they have the mobile steppers, and this is gonna get as close to a carousel. I know a lot of people, some people have even added me on Discord asking for an example of a carousel component. This is probably the closest you're going to get to a carousel component, and it's mostly used like this. So for example, here is what it looks like if you want to use the mobile stepper. As you can see, it's very reminiscent to the carousel. And then to top it all off, they actually have an example where you have the slide effect from React Slidable Views, where it looks slidable. My opinion, I think this whole carousel component is something that a lot of people really want out of Material UI. I don't know if people have been raising issues on GitHub, or if anyone's, if there's any reason why they haven't done it yet. But I personally think that this carousel component should be a component in its own, and not sort of just a mobile breakpoint from the vertical stepper. So here's an example of, instead of using like labels with icons for mobile, they just have dots. And also instead of like, you know, these numbers, and also an example with like progress bars, so people can see where they are. Now, as you can see, there are a ton of different sort of icons, or sorry, a ton of different components that come into the actual stepper, but I just want to look at the props for the actual stepper component itself, and highlight a couple of very important props. So number one is active step. This is indexed by 0, but you'll see in a second when we go to the demo, when you pass in a certain amount of steps, it will know which step you're on by having this active step prop passed in with the number itself. So if the number of the active step state variable is 0, it'll think you're on the first step. If it's 1, it'll think you're on the second step. So it's just indexed by 0. If you set it to -1, you can disable all the steps in there as well. Alternate label is just a boolean. We talked about it before. If it's true, it will set the label to be sort of like hanging down like that instead of right beside. Then the next thing I want to look at is connector. So connector, it will by default pass in a default step connector component. Now this step connector component, you can sort of, they don't have any examples obviously because they bunched the examples into here, but if we go into those customizable ones, so for example, if I scroll all the way down, let's find the step connector. Oops. So let's see. Okay, so it looks like in this example what they're doing is they have a bunch of different step connectors, and they're sort of styling it through with styles their own way, but essentially and I also don't really like this example, but what they're essentially doing here is for this step connector, where did it go? Step connector, sorry, I was looking at step content. So if we click on the step connector, so what they're doing here is this step connector doesn't have any props you can pass in, but it has a bunch of different CSS rules you can overwrite. So when you pass in the classes prop, you can target all of these attributes here, and you can pretty much make them whatever you want using CSS style. So that's essentially what they were doing with that example here. So they have 3 examples of different step connectors, and it looks like this one was the color one. So probably this one right here, and you're seeing that they're passing in a bunch of different classes. And if you're not too familiar with how passing in classes goes, I have a video of it. It's one of the earlier videos in the series, but just to give you a TLDR, essentially what you can do is you can target all these CSS attributes into the classes prop, and when each one of these is activated, like for example this horizontal CSS attribute, the styles that you add to this horizontal attribute will be applied if the orientation is horizontal, which is the default for orientation. You can have vertical or horizontal like we saw in the examples there. So you can see here they're passing in props for class overrides for if it's active, for if it's completed, and the line itself. So that's essentially what they're doing there. They apply different colors. You can see here they gave it a height, a border of 0, and a border radius. So that's what sort of gives it, you know, the border radius is what gives it that sort of thing. The color is what gives it obviously their color, and that's sort of how they are doing it. Usually you're not going to have multiple, unless you like are going to have one step connector for every single different thing. Usually you'll have the same step connector for the entire stepper. And if you do that, you can just instead of sort of wrapping the component with styles like they're doing here, you can use make styles, declare it, and just pass it into the step connector component that you pass in as a prop to the actual stepper itself, and just override the classes. I think it's a lot cleaner code, and I think it's a lot simpler. But that is just an example of how, that's just me trying to explain how they are doing it. Now the last prop, actually I think I covered all the props. You can see nonlinear is going to be either true or false. And if it's true, obviously you'll get a nonlinear one, and you'll have to sort of pass in, you'll deal with the stepper a bit differently. And then the orientation, horizontal or vertical, pretty self-explanatory. When it'll default to horizontal, but when you set it to vertical, it'll give you that nice sort of drop-down feel that we saw here. Now let's go straight into the sandbox.io of the most basic linear thing. So if you're not familiar, you can show the source of the code here, but I like to go into click this button right here, and it'll bring you into the sandbox.io demo that they have here. You just click on the demo file right here, and it'll open it up for you. Now I'm going to close this to make sure the code is a bit bigger, and you'll see here it's just the same example that we had over here. And if you're wondering why the styling, aka if you're wondering why the actual it's not as dark, so for example here everything's dark but over here it's not, it is because I have dark theme turned on. Oops, I have where's that toggle right here? I have dark theme turned on my documentation, and they use the theme throughout all their examples. So when dark theme is turned on for the entire website, it's also turned on for all the examples. Just a quick side note. So let's jump into how this code works. So you can see here we have a bit of styling. We're not really going to cover that too much because all they're really doing is adding some spacing around things to make it a bit more readable. And at the root of things, making the width 100%, so this doesn't get cut off or anything like that. Now, get steps, you'll see here that this is a function that returns an array, and this array is pretty much the array of the titles for every single step. And I'm going to get into how they use all of this in a second. Now, the second thing they have here is the get step content. They pass in a step, which is going to be a number, and depending on what step it is, they will return the content to be shown in here. Now, I should note here that they could have just as easily had an array, and maybe you know, what they could have done was they could have passed in the step into that array, and then, you know, added the step here, so it'll return whatever step that it was currently on, type of thing. Now, what I want to talk about is why they didn't do that. And even though in this example it would make sense, and a sort of switch statement is sort of overkill since you're just returning text, and you could have just as easily stored all this in an array and just called the index of the array depending on what the step was. The reason that they didn't do this, I think, was because in a real application, the content that you're going to be displaying here isn't just going to be the actual text itself. It's probably going to be something more complex, like its own individual component. You might have, you know, like a campaign setting component, and in there you have like a bunch of forms that would connect to like a Redux store, or some sort of data store, so that when they enter information in there, you know, even if you use Formic from my last video, you would be able to, you know, validate the information and then move on to the next step and ensure that all that information carries over, so that by the time they finish the entire stepper, you can use that data however you need. Which is why I think they set it up here, because it might look a bit cleaner if instead of, you know, having an array, it's a lot easier to read if you pass in, you know, like another component like campaign settings form or something like that, right? So I just want to illustrate that, because in these two functions they're almost doing something the same, but they're doing it in completely different ways. And this is one of the reasons I think why this component is so confusing to a lot of people. Now, let's go down here and look at the actual function itself. First thing we do is we set up our classes through use styles. This is very standard. Then the next thing we do is you'll notice we have two different state variables. The first state variable is our active step. And if you're not too familiar with React hooks and setting a state variable, all we're saying is we have a state variable called active step. We're going to initialize it to 0. And whenever we want to change this to anything else, here's our setter function. So if we wanted to change it to 1, we could simply do set active step to like 1, 2, or whatever we want to change it to. Now, we also have skipped, and that skipped is another state variable. It's going to work in the same way, but it's going to be initialized to a set, so an empty set. And you'll see why in just a second. And then finally, we have we declare steps, which is just equal to get steps, which just pretty much returns this array. We could have just as easily just taken this array, put it in a constants file, then import it, or even just popped it in there like that. But I guess the separation sort of helps the flow of the code. Now we have another function, and this function is going to be setting which steps are optional. So this is sort of a function that you call to check whether or not your step is optional. And we see only the step that is at index 1 is optional, which is the second step, because remember, these steps are indexed by 0. So if we wanted to make the first step optional, we would set that to 0. If we wanted to make it multiple of them optional, what I might do is, for example, create a set and then put all the optional, I'd be like optional set equals new set, and then in here I might create like maybe step 1 is optional and step 2 is optional. And remember, these are really the second and third steps because all the sets are indexed by 0. And then what I would do I would be like, set dot contains, or whatever it is for JavaScript, check if item in set, let's see, has. So I would do, set.has step, and that would make it so that I could modify all the steps that would be optional. And you'll see here, now that I set it to optional, the second step, indexed by 0, is optional, and you can skip that type of thing to finish it. So that's how I would do it personally, but that's the way the Material UI documentation shows it. So then we get to is step skip. So this is another checker function, and what that will do is if you're on a certain set, it will check if it has, or step, sorry, it will check to see if it has been previously skipped before. So you'll see in just a second, if we were to skip a step, what it will do is it will go to the next step, and it will add that it will add that steps number to the skipped sets set. So sort of confusing because there's a lot of words that start with S in there, but that is essentially what it was doing. And this function is just a checker function to see whether or not the current step we are on has been skipped in the past. And the way we do that is by checking whether or not our skipped set has the step inside of there. Wow, that's a mouthful. And you'll see that in use in just a second as well. So then we finally get to the point where we have the handle. Actually, before we go to the handle next, which is sort of where the meat of everything is happening, is let's look at the handle skipped. All this will do, when you click the skip button on any one of these things, what it will do is we'll call this handle skip function. Now the first thing it will do is it will check whether or not, so they have this little check in there, and even though the skip button won't show up, they've coded it so the skip button will only show up if the step is optional, they still recommend having an additional check to make sure that the current step you are on is not optional. And that's where this, set is optional thing comes in. Because if someone finds a way to fire this handle skip function on a step that is not optional, it could sort of, ruin the flow of things, especially if one step's data depends on the previous step's data, and the previous step was not optional. So they don't really have a good way of dealing with it. They just throw an error, but there's like, yeah, you probably should do it, even though they've coded it to not happen. I'm not sure why, but that's just the nature of the way they've coded it, I suppose. And then finally we get to the actual meat. So what they're doing is they're setting the active step to be equal to whatever the previous one was plus one. And you can see they're calling this React setter function, and they're calling it with this variable passing into it. And this, what it'll do when you use this with a React setter function that's created through use state, is it will just this variable will always just be whatever the current variable is at. And they use that as, quote, the previous one, and then they do it plus one. They could have just as easily just replaced all of this with the active step plus one. Again, not sure why, but that's just the way they've coded it. And I just wanted to explain that so it's not as confusing to everyone that is reading this. And then the final thing they do is they all they are really doing here is adding. So this skipped set, all they are doing is adding the current steps index to skip step. Right? And the way they did it could be a bit confusing. So what they're doing is they're creating a new set that is the duplicate of the previous set. Then they're adding our active steps value, the index of the step that we're trying to skip, to this new set, and then they're returning it, and that will set it as the new thing. So it's a bit confusing. I guess it's more in line with the way React does things, but if you really wanted to, you could have just made like const skip equals new set, and then just use the built-in so this is let's call it like skip2 or something, and then using the built-in set functions like let's see, JavaScript, I think it's .add, so skip2 .add, for example, and then you could add like the index of your active step, or even, and when you want to remove it, let's see, is it .remove or .delete, and then you just put like the active step index. So there's a way easier way to do this. I don't know why they chose to do it like this, but just so you're aware of it, you can replace that with just you don't have to use a state variable. You don't have to do all the state stuff in such a weird way. You can literally just have one set and just modify that set. And then they have this handle reset function, and all that will do is set active step to 0, which is pretty self-explanatory. And then we get to the actual JSX side of things. So this, once you understand everything we just went through, this is a lot simpler to understand, and it's not too crazy. So we have our stepper. We pass in the active step variable, which pretty much just comes from our state variable that we declared up there. And then within there, they just map through all the different steps, and they pass in the step itself and the step label as a prop. You can see here we have some conditionals. So for example, if this step is optional, we're going to add the optional typography under it. Seems I broke stuff. Let me quickly get it back to a working state by Control-Zetting, just so you could see the what did I do here? This should be working. Let me refresh it, just so you could see the optional text that, yeah. So here we go, we're back to normal. You can see here, if it'll do something like, is the step optional? It'll use that function again and see whether or not it's optional, and if it is, it'll set the label props to having this caption of optional, and it'll pass that in to the step label. And then, for example, if this, so they also have a check to see whether or not that step was skipped, and if it is not, for example, if I skip this step, you'll see here it doesn't get a check mark like the previous one, and that's where it's getting that. And then pretty much all of this from here on down is just logic that you have over here, under the actual stepper itself. So for example, if the active step is equal to the last steps, it'll say you're completed and show the reset button. Otherwise, it'll show, for example, the content for the step. It'll show the button to go back. If this step is optional, it'll show the skipping button. That's what this thing is doing here. And then finally, for this button over here, the last button, if and by the way, the back button will be disabled if the active step is equal to 0, aka we're on the first step. And then finally for the last button, if our active step is equal to the steps.length minus 1, it'll show that it's finished, aka if we're on the last step. Otherwise, it'll show the button as next. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I know it can be really confusing, especially because they chose to do things in a somewhat inconsistent way, and also a sort of a way that was highly unnecessary, which I think really overcomplicates. Like, if I was someone that was new to Material UI and, you know, someone new to React, and I was looking at this, I would be like, all right, I don't think I should use this component. But hopefully this video broke everything down to a level that makes it easier to understand and easier to work with. And yeah, if you found value in this video and it helped in any way, I can't tell you how much I would love to read a comment. If you have any feedback, I would love to read that as well. If you drop a like, smash the like button, and you know, maybe hit me with a subscribe. It really mean a lot to me. The reason I do this is because I love interacting with everyone, and I love sort of sharing knowledge of one of my favorite UI libraries out there with the world. And some of the comments I read are absolutely amazing, and it's what keeps me sort of going with this. So thank you so much for all the positive feedback, all the negative feedback, even to help me improve. And yeah, I hope you're all staying safe, and I'll see you guys next week.